Jack, a middle-aged taxi driver carrying the weight of his own personal struggles, picks up an elderly passenger one quiet evening. The man, burdened with sorrow and the regrets of a life lived, sits in the back seat, unaware that his encounter with Jack will soon set off a chain of events neither of them could predict. After the ride, Jack discovers that the elderly passenger has left behind a worn diary, its pages hinting at a decision that could change his life forever. Driven by a desire to help, Jack tracks down the elderly man the next day, hoping to stop him from making what he fears is a grave mistake. But when an unexpected call arrives, Jack is left questioning everything he thought he knew about the man and the powerful impact of a single act of kindness. What started as a simple ride turns into a journey that transforms Jack's life in ways he never imagined. Hi everyone, welcome back to Unveiled Narratives. Today, I have another heartfelt story to share with you. The passenger got into the back seat of the taxi. The streets were calm, lit by the soft glow of streetlights, and the night felt unusually quiet. The man, in his late 60s, looked tired, his face showing signs of weariness. He barely responded to Jack's greeting, just nodding slightly toward the road before settling into his seat. Jack noticed the silence, sensing something was off with the man. It was another quiet ride, he thought as he drove through the streets, focusing on the road, eager to finish his shift and go home. But then, breaking the silence, he heard a faint sound from the back seat. It wasn't exactly a sob, but it sounded like someone trying to hold back tears. Jack looked in the rearview mirror and saw the passenger, who had been quiet before, now holding a small, worn diary. Tears were running down his cheeks as he flipped through the pages, each one bringing a brief smile that quickly faded into sadness. Jack could tell the man was carrying something heavy, something more than just being tired. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he wondered whether he should say something or leave him alone. The man hadn't asked for help, but the sadness in the air was hard to ignore. Jack glanced in the mirror again, hoping to find the right moment to say something, but the words didn't come. He looked at the water bottle in the cup holder, then without thinking too much, he picked it up and offered it to the man. "Here, this might help," he said softly, trying to keep his tone casual. The passenger looked up, startled, and quickly wiped his tears. Jack turned his eyes back to the road, pretending not to notice. After a short pause, the man took the bottle with a soft "thank you." His voice was raspy as he opened it and took a few sips, his hands trembling as he tried to hide his emotions. The silence in the car felt heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts. Jack wanted to do more but felt the man needed space. The diary, once tightly gripped, now rested on the seat beside him as he stared out the window. Jack turned on the radio, letting soft instrumental music fill the silence. It wasn't much, but he hoped the calming tune and the quiet understanding between them could bring a bit of comfort. As the taxi neared the destination, Jack slowed down, his hands lightly resting on the steering wheel. He pulled up to the curb and put the car in park, glancing at the elderly passenger in the rearview mirror. The man sat still for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Jack wasn't sure if he should say something, anything to break the silence. But before he could find the right words, the passenger opened the door and stepped out of the taxi. Jack started to speak, but the man shook his head, a quiet, firm gesture that seemed to say, "No need." The elderly man reached into his wallet, pulling out the fare. For a moment, he paused, his fingers brushing over the remaining bills as though he was trying to make a decision. Then, without saying anything, he handed Jack everything left in his wallet. "Consider it a tip," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack stared at the money in his hand, stunned. It was far more than a simple tip, more than what Jack made in a whole week. "This is too much," Jack said, his voice rising in disbelief as he turned toward the man, but the passenger was already walking away. His steps were slow and heavy, and he didn't look back, his gaze fixed straight ahead. It was as though he was carrying a burden too heavy to share. Jack watched the man walk down the dimly lit street, his mind racing. The tip wasn't just generous, it felt strange, almost unsettling. Why would someone so lost and burdened give so much, so easily? It didn't feel like a simple act of gratitude. Shaking his head, Jack turned his attention back to the empty back seat, but for a brief moment he could still picture the man sitting there, holding the worn diary. Then something caught Jack's eye. There, tucked into the corner of the seat, was the very same diary the elderly man had been clutching tightly during the ride. Jack's chest tightened as he stared at the diary. How could the man have left it behind? He had held onto it like it was something very important to him. Jack's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, his mind racing with questions. What could be inside? Why would someone so attached to it leave it behind? For a moment, Jack debated whether he should look. It felt intrusive. But the image of the man flipping through the pages of the diary, tears streaming down his face, stayed in his mind. Jack hesitated, but curiosity finally overcame his doubts. He reached for the worn leather cover. As Jack flipped through the pages, the first few revealed photographs. They showed a family sharing happy moments. A young boy and girl laughing, a woman with a warm smile, and the man himself, younger and carefree. Jack felt a pang in his chest as he looked at the images. They were memories of better times, now overshadowed by the sadness he had seen in the man's face. Then came the handwritten entries. The early pages were filled with love and nostalgia, describing precious memories from a life full of meaning. But as Jack read further, the tone began to change. The joy faded, replaced by loneliness. The words became heavier with pain and regret, each line more haunting than the last. Finally, Jack reached the last page. There, scrawled hastily in shaky handwriting, was a single sentence. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, sharp and final. Jack's breath caught in his throat, and a cold wave of dread washed over him. He quickly closed the diary, his hands trembling. Without thinking, Jack slammed the car into gear and made a sharp U-turn, tires screeching as he sped back the way he had come. His heart raced as he glanced at the clock on the dashboard, the minutes slipping away far too quickly. Every second felt like it was tightening a knot in his chest. "I hope I'm not too late," Jack muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the city blurred past him. The diary sat on the passenger seat, a silent reminder of the man he needed to find. When Jack reached the park where he had dropped the elderly man off, he quickly jumped out of the car, clutching the diary tightly in his hand. His eyes scanned the area, but the dim glow of the streetlights made it hard to see clearly. Then he spotted him, sitting alone on a bench, head bowed, shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "Sir, you forgot this," Jack called out gently, holding up the worn diary. The elderly man lifted his head, startled. His eyes, red and tired, flickered to the leather book in Jack's hand. For a moment, there was silence. "Did you read it?" the elderly man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did," Jack replied quietly, his voice soft. "I'm sorry. I couldn't just leave you like that." The elderly man's expression darkened for a brief moment, a mix of embarrassment and anger crossing his face. He didn't say anything, only stared at the diary, shoulders sagging as if carrying a heavy weight. Jack sat beside him, careful to leave some space between them. He could sense the man's inner struggle, the tension in his posture. "I know it's not my place," Jack said gently, his voice steady, "but I couldn't just walk away after what I saw." The elderly man didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the diary, lost in thought. Finally, he muttered, "When my wife was alive, she always told me to be there for the kids. I didn't listen. I was too busy with work, my ego. Now, they won't even take my calls." Jack's chest tightened as he listened to the man's regret. He understood that pain, the sting of lost time and the weight of guilt. "I get it," Jack said softly. "I lost my wife, too, a few years ago. I thought I'd never get up again." He paused, his voice catching slightly, but then he added, "But then I looked at my daughter. She needed me. And I realized my wife would want me to keep going. For her, for the life we built together. She'd want me to live, not give up." The elderly man looked at Jack, his eyes glistening with pain. "I've lost everything," he muttered, shaking his head. "I have no reason to keep going." Jack leaned in closer, speaking gently but with conviction. "It's not too late. You still have time. Time to reach out, to try again. If your wife were here, what do you think she'd say? I bet she'd want you to fight, not give in." The elderly man was silent, still staring at the diary. Jack continued, "I know it's hard, but as long as you're breathing, you have time to fix things, even if it's just one small step at a time. You don't have to do it alone. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card, placing it beside the elderly man. That's my number, Jack said. Call me anytime. No matter what time, even 3 a.m. I'll be there. Just think about it. Don't give up yet. The elderly man didn't speak. He only stared at the card, his fingers brushing over it gently. Jack's heart raced, unsure if his words had made any difference. I've said what I can, Jack said softly. The rest is up to you. He stood to leave, but before walking away, he glanced back. The elderly man remained still, the diary in his lap, the card beside him. His posture was rigid, but Jack noticed a small change, barely perceptible, but it gave him hope. When Jack got home, the feeling of that night still lingered with him. He opened the door, and his young daughter ran up to him with a bright smile. You're home, Daddy, she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. Jack knelt down and hugged her tightly, his weariness fading away for a moment. I'm home, sweetheart. Did you have a good day? He asked softly. After tucking her into bed and giving her a kiss goodnight, Jack went back to the living room. The silence felt heavier now. He sat on the edge of his old couch, his phone resting on the coffee table in front of him. The hours passed by slowly, but Jack didn't sleep. Every time his eyes started to close, he'd snap them open again, hoping to hear the phone ring. A part of him knew that the call might never come, but he stayed awake anyway, just in case. It wasn't about duty, it was about hope. Hope that the elderly man had listened to what Jack said and that his words had planted even a tiny seed of change. As the first light of morning started to peek through the curtains, Jack's phone suddenly rang, shattering the silence. His heart skipped a beat, a mix of relief and anxiety flooding him. He quickly grabbed the phone and answered without hesitation. Is this Jack? The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. Yes, this is Jack, he replied, his curiosity rising. Is everything okay? I'm calling about the man you helped last night, the voice continued. He's asked for you to come to the park. We're waiting for you. It's important. Jack froze. His relief quickly turned into unease. Is he okay? He asked, concern creeping into his voice. There was a brief pause before the caller responded. It's better if you come and see for yourself. Please. The line went dead before Jack could ask anything else. The air felt cold as Jack stood up, quickly grabbing his coat and rushing out the door. The streets were still quiet, and the world was just starting to wake up. But Jack's mind was racing with questions. When Jack arrived at the park, he spotted the elderly man sitting on the same bench as the night before. But this time, he wasn't alone. Two men stood beside him. They were dressed in neat suits, looking like they had just stepped out of a meeting. One of the men turned to Jack and nodded politely. You're Jack, right? He asked, his tone calm and friendly. Yes, I am, Jack replied, his curiosity growing. Is everything okay? The elderly man slowly stood up, his movements steady. When he met Jack's eyes, his face softened. Jack, he said, his voice full of emotion. These are my sons. I finally called them. I told them everything. Jack blinked, looking from the elderly man to the two men standing beside him, unsure of what to expect. Before Jack could say anything, one of the sons stepped forward with a small smile. We wanted to meet you, he said, his voice calm and sincere. Our father told us what you said to him last night. He said you reminded him of something we'd all forgotten. The other son spoke next, his tone gentle. He called us this morning after years of silence. He called us. We didn't realize how much he'd been holding in. You gave him the courage to reach out? Jack was shocked. He hadn't imagined his small gesture would have such an impact. The first son stepped closer, extending his hand, followed by the second son. Thank you, they both said with genuine warmth. You gave our father something we couldn't. You brought us back together. The elderly man smiled through tears. Jack, he said, his voice full of gratitude. You didn't just help me last night. You gave me back my family. I'll never forget that. The elderly man pulled a small envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to Jack. This is for you, he said softly. Jack hesitated, his heart racing as he opened the envelope. Inside was a large sum of money, far more than he'd ever seen in one place. It was enough to clear his debts, cover his daughter's school fees, and even buy a new taxi. I can't take this, Jack said, looking up at the elderly man. "This is too much. I didn't help you expecting anything in return." The elderly man shook his head, his eyes shining. "Jack, you gave me back my family. No amount of money can match what you've done for me. Please don't see this as repayment. See it as my way of ensuring you can live your life without the burdens that weigh you down." Jack was torn, his heart filled with both gratitude and humility. "I don't know if I can accept this. I was just doing what anyone would have done." One of the sons stepped forward, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Our father insisted, and so do we," he said kindly. "This isn't charity. It's gratitude. You gave us back a father we thought we'd lost." The elderly man leaned in, his voice firm but soft. "Please, Jack, let me have this moment. Let me know that I've helped someone as much as they've helped me. You gave me the greatest gift. I have my sons back, and now," he smiled, his voice breaking slightly, "I have 3 sons." Jack's eyes welled up with tears. He nodded, accepting the envelope with a mix of reluctance and gratitude. As they shared an embrace, Jack felt a deep connection and hope. A small act of kindness had changed not only his life but theirs too. In the weeks that followed, the bond between Jack and the elderly man grew stronger. Jack often joined the family for dinners, where laughter and stories filled the room. The elderly man proudly introduced Jack to anyone who asked, saying with a smile, "This is Jack, my 3rd son." Together, they celebrated a second chance at life and family. The elderly man, once weighed down by regret, had found his way back to his children. The family had reunited, and Jack had played a key role in making that happen. It wasn't just about a taxi ride anymore. It was about the power of kindness and the connections that can form between people, no matter how brief their encounters. Jack's small act of compassion had given the elderly man something far more important than money. It had given him his family back. Jack, in turn, found new meaning in his own life. The quiet nights, the lonely drives, and the weariness that had once felt so heavy were now filled with a sense of hope. He knew that sometimes the smallest gestures can change everything, and the people you least expect to touch your life are the ones who end up making the biggest difference. The story doesn't end with the bond Jack built with the elderly man and his family. It continued to remind him of the value of kindness, not just in grand gestures, but in the small, everyday moments. Jack was no longer just a taxi driver going through the motions of his work. He had witnessed firsthand how a simple act of compassion could bring about profound changes in people's lives. His perspective on life started shifting. He noticed the people around him more, their faces, their struggles, the unspoken words between them. Jack started reaching out when he saw someone in need, not out of obligation but from a place of understanding. He knew how much a small gesture could mean, how it could lift someone's spirits or even change their whole outlook. As the days passed, Jack's life felt fuller. He had formed connections that went beyond the usual exchange between a taxi driver and passenger. The elderly man's family became a part of Jack's world, and he, in turn, became a part of theirs. And whenever Jack sat at his kitchen table, having a meal with his daughter, or even just sitting quietly in his living room, he couldn't help but smile. He was reminded of the truth that the smallest acts of kindness often have the greatest impact, and in helping others, you may just find the help you didn't know you needed yourself. Jack's life began to change in ways he never expected. He felt a deeper connection with the people around him, especially his daughter. Every time he looked at her, he thought about the elderly man's words and how his family had been reunited. Jack realized that by being kind and showing a little compassion, he had made a real difference in someone's life. He felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. The burden of his debts didn't feel as heavy anymore. The fear of his old taxi breaking down and leaving him without a job wasn't so overwhelming. It wasn't about the money or the tip anymore. It was the feeling that he had done something meaningful, that he had helped someone in a way that mattered. Jack's thoughts often wandered to the elderly man and his family. He knew that the man would never forget the kindness Jack had shown, and he hoped the same kindness would keep spreading. In a world where so many people felt alone, Jack had found a way to make a real, lasting impact. The months passed, and Jack's life began to feel a little lighter. The elderly man and his family had become a part of his own life. They shared dinners, laughter, and stories. The man proudly called Jack his third son, always introducing him with a smile, making Jack feel like he truly belonged. It was a bond that was formed from a small act of kindness, but it had turned into something that lasted. Jack realized that sometimes the simplest actions, like offering a ride, listening to someone's pain, or sharing a quiet moment, could change the course of someone's life. What started as a simple taxi ride had turned into a second chance for a man and his family. And for Jack, it had given him a renewed sense of hope and a reminder of the power of compassion. Every time Jack looked at his daughter, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The weight of his past mistakes seemed a little lighter, and the future felt brighter. Life had a way of surprising him, and he knew that with every small act of kindness, the world could be a better place. And so, Jack and the elderly man's family remained close, their connection stronger than ever, proving that even the smallest gesture can change lives in ways you never expect.